it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Welcome to Undead Live, reporting from the front lines of the zombie apocalypse. We have your back morning, noon, and night, whether you're dead, undead, recently deceased, or fully alive. I'm Athena Actipus.
And I'm Dave Lundberg-Kenrick.
And it is our pleasure today to be talking about PR, public relations in the zombie apocalypse and other crisis situations.
That's right. And how to get the message of sort of hope and keeping going across in what seem like hopeless situations. So, which is perfect for apocalypses.
Right. Hope is only lost if we're not working together to try to solve the problem, right?
Yeah, which I think we're going to talk about that because I think it's maybe there are times where it seems like hope is lost no matter what, but maybe they're not. So So
and we have an amazing guest today joining us, Marvin Stockwell.
Hello.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and Marvin is the director of public relations for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Marvin, you have some experience with dealing with PR crises in sort of relatively apocalyptic situations, right? With our recent COVID pandemic that's lasted now over a year, really. How do you, as a research hospital, handle a global crisis like this in a way that both serves your the institution that you work for, but also serves the community?
Right. So, the classic PR framing question that we're trained to ask ourselves as PR practitioners is, what would a reasonable person expect a responsible organization to do in this situation? But and I think historically, we all think of that as the kind of like BP oil crisis, scenario where it's one organization's crisis. But of course, the pandemic was the world's crisis, and we all had a role to play in it. So St. Jude was no different. St. Jude had to take that logical kind of like pause and deep breath to say, what would a reasonable person expect a responsible organization like St. Jude to do in this pandemic? And how can St. Jude be helpful and useful? And that was something that was worth a question like that forces you to slow down and not just ask, what should we say? Or what should we do? Because those questions can kind of make you be jumpy and make you think and overly focus you on your image and how you're perceived. You really have to start with what can we do that's the responsible, good thing to do? And not only did St. Jude have a role to play in making our deep bench of infectious diseases experts available to kind of inform the news-consuming public, but in time, we found ways to do pandemic-specific new things to help the world, one of which was...
Yeah, Marvin, before we get into that, can I ask you a question? So, when you're talking about this approach, in a crisis of not just focusing on your image, when we think about PR, when most of us think about PR, that's kind of where we go. We think about, managing your image, making sure that you're, keeping your presenting your brand well, while a crisis is going on. What's the difference between the sort of, image focus in PR versus what you're kind of advocating for, this, thinking about, what should a responsible organization do?
Well, in the instance of St. Jude, my job is to elevate our science and research. And the way to do that, obviously, in the pandemic is to say, what research are we doing that could actually inform the world in a really helpful way? So virology was obviously our strong suit, which is not to say that other stories didn't continue to work our way through our office. We didn't stop working on cancer and other pediatric diseases. But I think the pandemic taught us that it's the organizations who find a way to be useful. And that doesn't have to just be nonprofits, even for-profit businesses found a way. If you could find a way to serve the world, you just jumped in front of everyone else. And I think that that's something that we should all really think about and just know. I mean, I'm not suggesting you should do that for the benefits of it, but I'm saying the benefits do come if you orient your thinking that way.
Yeah, Christina Baciu here is saying that it sounds like the way that you're talking about PR, it really is about social responsibility as opposed to just image management. What's the relationship between PR and social responsibility?
Yeah, I guess I chose to go into nonprofit PR for a reason. I wanted to be able to put my heart behind something I really believed in, which is to throw no shade at people who go into corporate PR or agency PR. But I just knew myself as a values-driven person, and I wanted to be able to advocate for things that I really truly believed in or that really excited me. And that's not hard to do at St. Jude because we do cutting-edge scientific research that truly is helping to save lives. So that's not a hard mission to get your heart behind. I think image is, it's undeniably a part of it. Obviously, we want to contribute to the scientific discussion out there, but we also want to be viewed as a leader in science that's doing cutting edge scientific research, because one output of that is we want to have that fuel recruiting, because we want to hire the fantastic scientists of tomorrow to keep doing that cutting edge research and keep moving those cure rates on those pediatric cancers higher and higher, making the treatment less and less toxic. So image and actually delivering true value are connected. I just think it's better to focus on delivering value and then letting that drive your sterling image rather than the other way around.
So right before the show, you were sort of telling us the history of St. Jude Children's Hospital. And I think that really captured this sort of sense of how like messaging and research can go hand in hand, because you were saying that children's cancer was sort of a thing that was thought of as almost unbeatable, right? So could you sort of run us through?
Sure.
Yeah, it's actually, I mean, I think there's also this bigger picture of, when we think about hospitals, there's differences among hospitals, right, and how they're run. And I think a little bit of background also on just, how is St. Jude different from your typical research hospital, and how does that make a difference for how you're able to operate?
Yeah, well, St. Jude was really founded on a different model, and people kind of shake their head and they can't believe that that we don't, no patient families ever receive a bill from St. Jude. That was one of the kind of foundational planks that Danny Thomas, our founder, wanted to make sure was part of how he set St. Jude up. A lot of people say, well, why is it called St. Jude? Well, Danny Thomas was a devout Catholic, and he was a down on his luck actor, and he said a prayer to St. Jude Thaddeus, the patron saint of hopeless causes, and said, show me my way in life and I'll build you a shrine. The very next day, he got an acting gig, and he saw that his prayers had been answered. Years later, he went through a discernment process with a priest friend of his, Cardinal Stritch, who they started talking about, like, well, what is the lost cause of our day? And pediatric cancer, back in 1962, when the hospital was founded, was considered a lost cause. It was considered, the prevailing wisdom was make the child comfortable so they can die in peace, which is crazy to consider, right? And Danny Thomas founded St. Jude, and he hired the young Don Pinkel, who came here, and he had this radical idea that you could use cranial radiation to treat acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And within one kind of like trial regimen called Total Therapy 5, they moved the cure rate of acute lymphoblastic leukemia from 4% to 50%, which put the world on notice that pediatric cancer was indeed curable. And of course, we've been inching the cure rate up on ALL ever since. It's now like at about 94%. So in the span of 60 years, we've St. Jude and others, it's obviously we've done this in concert with others, have moved the cure rate of the most common form of pediatric cancer from 4% to 94%. So it just shows you what, like, belief in what's possible. That stemmed from Danny's own personal belief in prayer and in how to orient his life and point him toward what he was supposed to do in this mortal life. And he left behind a legacy that is pretty special.
We have so many comments coming in from the audience now. I think, this is such an inspiring idea. Even, the notion of having a hospital where you don't get a bill, given a lot of the struggles that many of us have had with, getting quality healthcare and, not getting charged an arm and a leg for it. Alana's pointing out that it's kind of utopian.
It is. It's a very special model, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that our fantastic fundraising colleagues at ALSAC St. Jude, our partner organization that raises more than $1 billion a year for us, they're fantastic at what they do in raising the funds. It does cost a lot of money to run St. Jude. It's not that we don't collect any fees if the patient has health insurance. We will bill health insurance, but the thing is, if our doctors never have to think, oh, well, this isn't covered, well, let me choose. Their treatment regimen is never dictated by cost, and that is an unbelievable luxury.
So, Marvin, what are some examples of ways that, you as a director of PR have pivoted in this time of crisis to sort of think about, what value can you deliver? How can you provide things that will, serve the community and also give positive attention for St. Jude?
Sure. Well, there are really in my mind, two really kind of pandemic specific things that St. Jude did. One, in the early days of the pandemic, members of our child life team and psychology department put together a coronavirus coloring book for children ages 5 to 9 to be able to work through their anxieties about the pandemic with a trusted adult.
We have some images from that.
That's right. Yeah.
So, Dave, do you want to pull some of those up? And Marvin, you can talk to us about them.
Well, so that team was already already assembled because they had put together other coloring books to help children work through their fears and anxieties of a medical diagnosis. So the connection between staffers was already there. And they started with our patients in mind, but then they thought, with a little bit of extra hustle, we could develop a public facing version of this coloring book that could be available worldwide to any child. So they created a public facing version of it. It's now been translated into 15 different languages and is available as a free download. And it's been downloaded tens of thousands of times by people all over the world. And subsequently, they created a tween version and a teen version so that children of all ages could kind of like digest what humanity is living through. And so from a PR perspective, obviously that was a really useful pitch for me. And like, it was so useful so right away that before I even wasted time to say, well, we should write a press release, I just took the thumbnail sketch of the idea and pitched it to a couple of reporters. Pretty soon it was in USA Today and in Forbes and The Hill and elsewhere. And after that, it was, on TV and radio, 70, 80, 90 times over the next couple of months. And that tracked well with psychology really coming to the fore in the pandemic. That's a very key discipline, is like, how do we all feel about this? And so those experts from a PR perspective, I was able to kind of get them out there because they produced something that was useful to the world. But then once they had the kind of attention and they were on the radars of all these reporters, they just kept getting called upon. I mean, not that I didn't pitch them proactively, but I'm just saying, like, a lot of it was just other reporters saw other stuff that they were doing in the media. So the coronavirus coloring book was a really great example early on.
Marvin, can I ask you? Alana is pointing out that really the images in the coloring book are quite friendly. I mean, even the coronavirus does not look particularly threatening. Was there a sort of process about kind of deciding on the tone for that coloring book?
Absolutely. Emily Van Gilder, the artist who did that, she was, I almost wore that team out. They were so sick of being doing media interviews, but they never complained. But no, so I've heard Emily talk about this before. That was intentional, making the coronavirus appear more crafty, like almost, I mean, you want to have it be taken seriously, but like it's also it's almost like it's mischievous looking, more so than outright scary. And that's because children learn through and process their feelings through interactive play, and if it's too scary to play with, then the tool isn't useful. So you have to check that box such that the kids go, oh well, this is interesting enough, and then they participate with it, and then that tees up conversations with their parents, etc.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, we have so many comments. People are just loving this coloring book and, pointing out
Go
that,
download it.
Yeah. I mean,
Great.
as you were talking, I was like, oh, that looks like fun. I mean, all of us, like with the pandemic, right? We're coloring, we're doing puzzles. I mean, maybe you need a puzzle version also so people can, sit around with their kids and do the,
Sure.
COVID puzzle.
Which is useful to parents, right? Like parents, like it tees up so it's the utility is for the kids, but also the parents. The parents might be thinking, oh gosh, how do I break this how do I contextualize this for them? Oh, you've already got your own thoughts through, coloring. Oh, well, and that just tees up a very natural dialogue that plays on that naturally existing kind of trusting relationship.
Yeah.
Very
And
organic.
it sounds also like, really leveraging play as a chance not only to process things, but also collectively process, right? Because if kids are starting to, play and interact that way, then they can talk with others. And that, I mean,
Right.
maybe that's a great way, a metaphor almost for, something that we should be doing as adults too, is like having space to talk about, to process, to, even play with these ideas so that we can have our collective attention more directed on how what we can do to ultimately make things better and get through the apocalypse.
Yeah, I mean, creative play is something that I think we all need. We're all children at heart. We've all found our different release valves in the pandemic to be restored. For me, it was riding my bike and being in nature every chance I got. And thankfully, we've got some great trails here in Memphis. And so I've been living on those rails to trails rides. And thankfully, with mobile technology, I can be on a webinar or on a conference call while I'm heading down the Shelby Farms Green Line.
So you're on your bike while you're in conference calls these days.
100%. Yes, absolutely.
That's awesome.
And at first I ducked it because I'm like, is this going to come across as not being professional? But it's like, if you're on a webinar where you're just trying to take in, and maybe you need to stop and come off mute and say something, but there's certain things where it doesn't work, but there are more opportunities than you'd imagine. And a lot of times, I might handle my stuff that really needs a full, keyboard and everything in the morning, send out a million pitches, right? And then wait for the kind of responses to come back in. And then I'd ride my bike out to Shelby Farms Park and just sit on the deck with a kombucha and just like work from my phone and headphones, just being out there at a park, after getting some aerobic exercise, got healthy endorphins. Anyway.
Sounds awesome, Marvin. And
yeah.
I get it. I've got my my kombucha right over here.
Very nice.
So,
oh, you make your own, huh?
Yeah.
That's cool. I don't think I have the temperament for that. But.
Sort of on the flip side, what was it like sort of at St. Jude's once the pandemic hit? That seems like that must have been scary.
Yeah, if anything, the coloring book provided us a great first thing to march out, because, we weren't immune to the fact that we were going, what is happening? Like we had the experts, the virology experts that knew the disease, but it's like how that works itself out in the world is still very chaotic, right? So you might think that our infectious diseases experts, their expertise might have immediate utility to the media. And of course it did, but we wanted to pump the brakes on that a little bit and make sure that we set the proper guardrails such that our infectious diseases experts wouldn't conflate their expertise with influenza, for instance, with COVID-19, which was a brand new disease. And so it took a while for us to kind of get a sense of the guardrails we needed to set around our infectious diseases experts to be as useful as they could be. That was one way we reacted. The coloring book was kind of like our first foray out there, and like, because it's kind of lovable. It's like, it's beautiful. It's kids we're being reassuring to children. It was a great first thing to march out. The third thing that we did, and that was really I think useful to the world in a way that it's to be the size that St. Jude is, and to be kind of globally recognized, it was something befitting our kind of like our abilities. And that's this. We just so happens that the annual convening of infectious diseases experts from all over the world, 24 different countries, were in Memphis in March. And they arrived in Memphis, and they were already all aware of the thing that was happening. And then they're like, they pushed their normal agenda aside. And they started reading everything they could about the coronavirus. And as they were leaving, they realized we have to have a mechanism to continue this collaboration and this continued investigation. And that's what gave rise to our global COVID-19 Observatory Registry for Pediatric Cancer. So we stood up a website, and for the last, since March, we've been tracking the data on children who both have cancer and who have tested positive for COVID-19. Not only are we interested in the data for what we might learn like long term, but we also created forums where oncologists from all across the world could connect in real time, because certain countries went through the worst of the pandemic first. Well, how valuable was that to have that expertise and that experience inform ones who were still bracing for their first wave? And so that helps us feel like, well, we did good in helping the kind of global oncology core prepare for not just the damage of the virus, but the damage to the health systems, which is actually in many instances the far greater damaging thing.
All the collateral damage from this apocalypse that we're in, right?
Yeah, the sad thing is that children, especially in low and middle income countries, who they had their care disrupted because healthcare resources were reallocated to fight COVID. And at least we have certain anecdotal reports that some of those children who had treatable cancers have died. Now, I hope that I can imagine that our forum didn't help mitigate that, and that's one of the reasons we set that up to do that. And time will tell when it publishes academically the degree to which that was a factor, but it's not hard to understand why that is. I mean, if you're an under-resourced country and you have X amount of nurses or X amount of supplies, and you have to respond to this emerging need that you hadn't planned for, it's going to, and people are less mobile,
Yeah, Marvin, what does this mean for future pandemics? I mean, are there lessons to be learned here? Both in terms of the overall, response of the medical system, but also how, people in your kind of role can be helpful in, connecting the needs of the community with the resources that are available in these institutions. And yeah, Carlo has this question, right? What does this mean for the next apocalypse? The next pandemic, the next unexpected challenge that we face.
Sure. Well, it's been noted that Singapore had a really great outcome with this coronavirus. And if you look into why, you'll realize it's because they got hit bad in the last coronavirus. My point is, they learned experientially that coronaviruses are not something to be, underestimated. And so they put in social distancing and mask wearing, protocols like immediately. And then they were all on board. That countries who fared poorly were the ones who did not, institute those policies and did not adhere to them. So my point is, and there's more to it, obviously, but I would think that humanity had not had a global pandemic in more than 100 years. There was no one alive who'd ever been through one, except in limited instances. So this was the first truly global pandemic. And I think now humanity is realizing that they are on the landscape. I think people are starting to realize that there's, the development and over encroaching on natural habitats plays a role. So I hope that will have good outputs. But my point is, the next time we won't take it lightly.
Yeah. So
You know,
Yeah. So Neil asks, from a PR point of view, and we had some questions earlier about this too, thinking kind of about what is going on at the level of communication with the public, from the government, from public health agencies. And from your perspective as an expert in public relations and communication, what should we do differently in the next pandemic to communicate?
yeah, I think one of the things that St. Jude did was to not only advocate for mask wearing and social distancing, but we realized this is a strength of the fact that St. Jude does enjoy the support of people from across the political spectrum. So when we stepped out and said St. Jude is behind this idea, we had a whole campaign, like asking people to wear a mask to protect the kids of St. Jude, because if the coronavirus is out there in the community, well, so are our staff. So if you care about the kids at St. Jude, wear a mask, because like we're doing all we can to safeguard our campus, but help us out here, right? So I would argue that we kind of like leveraged our authority and the kind of goodwill and positive feelings that people have for St. Jude and our mission and the children we serve, to try to really put our weight behind that and say this is important. And I would say there has to be more of that, and there has to be. I would hope that the lesson we've learned is listen to science. That science is the thing that is ultimately going to get us out of this pandemic, and that we just need to not treat it so lightly. And I think voices that advocate for that would probably be more forceful and faster next go around, and they'd be speaking to a public that already had learned, sadly, the hard way, that we ignore that at our peril.
Marvin, what would you do if you were in charge of public relations in the next pandemic apocalypse at the national level?
I would definitely try to, not assume that science voices are going to be believed. And so like, you might have an influencer campaign kind of on top of that. I mean, we found our way to a lot of that, but making the case for different target demographics is unavoidable. You have to do it. So just to kind of make a pronouncement and expect people to believe you, I just think finding those trusted voices, and then just the basic building blocks, which is to continue to do your job in good faith, add to the what the news consuming public is digesting. Like, for instance, there were some salacious and kind of like out there pieces that, like, in my role as PR guy, I declined those opportunities because it kind of was like, it was something that was like looking for clicks, right? Like to just be overly kind of like bizarre. And comedy of the absurd is I'm a fan of, but like there's a time and a place for it, right? And it's like, I think we avoided things where people were being, if we couldn't be helpful, if we were just kind of adding to the noise, then it's too tough to get the actual stuff you need to get through there. Without other things kind of like clogging up the chamber, so to speak. So a PR person's job is in what they decline, how they prep their faculty, and how you educate the journalist as to what's important. A lot of times this thing traveled so fast, a lot of times journalists would come to us and they didn't even know what they should be focusing on. So a lot of it's like, oh, well, you want a backgrounder with our infectious diseases experts because you need to understand what we're dealing with here. Oh, and then you can figure out the frame for your story. Oh, and then you can quote him or her, know.
Yeah.
So speaking of sort of champion things you believe in, before we go, I just wanted to ask you about, you have the podcast, right?
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick overview of that for anyone who
Sure. Champions of the Lost Causes is my podcast. It's part of the OAM network. I also blog at championsoftheLostCauses.org. it essentially, I got curious about why people have the fire in the gut to champion causes. It's more than just altruism, although that's a part. It's more than just community benefit. There is a kind of entrepreneurial see how much we can get away with, or how far we can evolve this, how far can we take it, kind of group dynamic at work. And so the podcast, I interview people who champion other causes. I'm also 6 years into my own cause. There was a dormant building here in Memphis, the Mid-South Coliseum, that we now have saved from the wrecking ball and are working hand in glove with our city as to exactly what it will become. So our work is not finished, but about 4 years into my work on that cause, I thought to myself, I must really love this. Like, why is it that I love it so much that I'm essentially willing to work an unpaid part-time job for 4 years just to affect something that I was told at the outset I was a fool it was a fool's errand to take up. What drives people to take on those causes? And just to link it back to St. Jude, I would argue that people, I'm sure, were telling Danny Thomas he was crazy. What are you doing? Like, pediatric cancer is incurable. Why, but it wasn't. And 60 years later, he was proven right. But he was the person who saw the lost cause of pediatric cancer and chose not to let it still sit there unaddressed. He chose to champion it. And 60 years later, the world's really glad that he did.
Marvin, that's so inspiring. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And my pleasure.
On Undead Live. And thank you to all of you for joining us today on this edition of Undead Live. And I just want to remind everybody that the best way to protect your brains in the zombie apocalypse is to share them.
It's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you. Makes me act the way